everybody, we are inside the Magic Circle once again, and today I am speaking with Laurelei Black. She is the author of 13 books, many of which are about Aphrodite and the worship of Aphrodite and the sexual aspects of that as well. So we're gonna delve into that subject a little bit. So if you are under the age of 18, please turn this video off. You're not allowed to watch it. This is not for you. Although I'm not going to put a restriction on it because we're going to keep our conversation in the realm of propriety. She's also the co-director of the Babalon Rising Festival, which takes place every year, or most years anyway. We've had a little bit of a break from everything, all of us. And she's also the publisher and owner of Asteria Books, which she's published many books with, including some of her own. So welcome, Laurelei.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is my great pleasure to be talking with you. I haven't talked with you in quite some time, so it's nice to get the opportunity to do this interview with you. I feel like a lot of the people who I do interviews with, I've met or interacted with in some way over the internet, just through business and whatnot. But I don't really know you all that well personally, so I look forward to learning more about you. So let's jump right in from the beginning. And how did you get involved in all of this stuff that I just listed?
Oh, well, my journey with magic and witchcraft and Aphrodite, and they're all very interconnected for me, began back in the late 90s when I was in college. I was just wrapping up my university experience in Bloomington, Indiana, and I got attracted to just sort of the occult in general and witchcraft, and I got involved with the Cups group in the area. I don't know how familiar you are with the
Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. I actually grew up a Unitarian Universalist, so I'm very familiar with it.
Oh, excellent. Well, it was very formative in my practice, actually, in the sense that there was a very strong Cups group that was being run in Bloomington at the time, led by two different women, one of whom's name I've completely forgotten, and then the other one was Anita Craft. Okay. And so Anita Craft is, she's an author herself. She's written a wonderful book on Kabbalah, and she's one of the co-founders of the Babalon Rising Festival. And so I had the privilege of meeting Anita and the OTO group that she was working with, the lodge that had formed there in Bloomington. It was EAO Lodge, I believe, back in like 1997. And so I've got my first introduction to ceremonial magic, to gematria, and like the whole 9 yards, to Goetia, to like all of it, at the same time that I was first reading, Wicca, Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and Uncle Bucky's Big Blue Book, and sort of all of these foundational Wicca and witchcraft based books. Did it all seem to be one thing to you, or did you see that they were very different paths? No, I saw that they were very different, but I also saw where, and at the time I didn't know necessarily what was overlap in concept and ideology, and what was something that had been borrowed from something else and sort of used here and there, and what was just sort of like foundational magical concepts within the Western tradition. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know how to parse that out. So I did a lot of like just silently watching and listening and absorbing from people that had been practicing for a decade or more already. And so
you joined the OTO?
I didn't at that time, but I made the commitment to join the OTO. So one of the things that I did was that I felt very drawn to something that I could only at the time describe as priestesshood. And I wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but I meditated about it, and I did a lot of like study and trying to pull things together. And I knew that a strong sort of research background and theoretical background was going to be important for me. And so I committed at that time to taking initiations within the OTO. It was the only magical order that I'd been exposed to at the time.
So was the OTO the first magical group that you got initiated into?
It actually wasn't. It took me years to come back to the OTO and get involved with them, because I moved out of the area. I moved out to Southern California. And even though, there are obviously
kind of a hotbed
wonderful
for OTO activity.
there is, yeah, there are a lot of OTO lodges out there. But I got very involved with the witchcraft community actually out there, and traditional witchcraft and the American flavors of traditional witchcraft.
And so what does that mean to you, just real quick?
Yeah, so there's a lot that it means, but it's a very non-Wiccan expression of witchcraft. So if you look at the writings, I don't know if you're familiar with the writings of like Robert Cochrane, yeah, and the Clan of Tubal-Cain and Evan John Jones, and sort of that type of expression of witchcraft. That's more what I've been drawn to in my own practice.
In case my viewers are less familiar with that, what do you how does that separate itself from Wicca in simple terms?
Yeah, what does that look like? So that's a good question.
Okay, let me put it this way. So in Wicca, we see a lot of sort of format similarities with OTO and Golden Dawn oriented stuff, calling the quarters and that sort of stuff, but you're focused on god forms as opposed, or pagan god forms as opposed to like angels or even Egyptian gods mostly, although sometimes they're present as well. But it's more focused on sort of like nature oriented gods a lot of the time, and then maybe a little bit of sort of Greek gods in there. So how is the traditional witchcraft that you got drawn to separate itself from that?
So traditional witchcraft tends to focus more on sort of what I would call Luciferian concepts, where there still might be some of the there is still some influence from ceremonial traditions and Hermetic traditions and that Western occult practice, but it's there's a draw to a lot more of the shamanic practices of Europe, of England particularly, and of Northern Europe. And so you're going to see a lot more spirit-based work, a lot more inner journeying work, a lot more search for personal gnosis, a lot more connection with land spirits and with personal deities, tutelary spirits, that type of thing. The holiday structure might be very different, and that can vary from tradition to tradition within traditional witchcraft. What one coven or group or kindred or clan might be practicing may be very different than what another one is. We don't necessarily hold to an 8 Sabbath cycle, for instance. Some of us do and some of us don't.
What would you do instead? Just the 4 quarters or the 4 cross quarters? Or
honestly, it can vary pretty dramatically. Some groups only do one holiday a year, and some do a cycle of 9, that aren't necessarily based on those solar and
is there a
holidays.
full moon meeting in the traditional witchcraft that you were exposed to?
There can be, and a lot of times within many tradcraft groups, the full moons will actually take a much higher precedence over those other Sabbats.
And so that's a time for coming together, but you also mentioned that there's a lot of sort of journeying. Does that take place within that circle, or is that something that happens outside of that?
It often takes place within one's personal compass, or within your came, within your personal space that you're working within.
Interesting. And so that drew your attention in Southern California.
It did.
How did you float back to OTO and Anita Craft?
When I came back to Indiana in 2003, it was just after the birth of my son. I came back in 2003. It was a few years later. I was practicing. I had already gotten involved with the sacred sexuality and with Aphrodite work that had sort of evolved out of my craft practice. Aphrodite had become a very important tutelary guide for me. And so I had already been very involved with that. And I went to an event at Our Haven Nature Sanctuary, to which you have been. That was where that's where Babalon Rising used to happen. And in the same year that I attended a sacred sexuality event there, Babalon Rising was having its first year. And so
Mm.
it kind of got on my radar. And a couple of years later, I came as a presenter. So I came out, and Anita Kraft was there, of course, because she was, she was one of the founders. And so I kind of went, well, this is kismet. And I just sort of got re-involved with the entire group and with the entire organization, and ended up sort of moving in with all of the organizers from Babalon Rising, which is not how one normally gets involved with things, but I just sort of like fell into, or stepped into, I guess is probably more accurate, this whole organizational role and the lodge that was happening down there in Louisville, down here, because that's where I am now.
So I think the observant viewer is going to notice that we jumped over a rather big subject, which was that between traditional witchcraft and Babalon Rising, there's your emergence as a priestess of Aphrodite. And
yes.
so,
yeah.
I would be remiss in not exploring that. So where did that come about? So you felt that, just as you felt this sort of inner priestess craft inside yourself wanting to emerge. How did it land on Aphrodite, and how did that develop further from there?
Yeah, so when I was out in Southern California, I got involved with a coven and a tradition there, and went through all of the degree systems through it. And so that was actually the first group to which I ever initiated, was that witchcraft coven. And as a part of that, I came into more contact with lots of different deities and spirits, and through the work that I was doing there, Aphrodite sort of stepped forward. And it was unusual because we really didn't work with a lot of Greek deities. We were really working with a lot more Celtic deities. And so I kept going, it can't be Aphrodite, and it can't be me and Aphrodite. Like, that just seems strange to me. And I don't know, I've talked with other people who have had this connection with Aphrodite, or sometimes with like other spirits, and they feel like, or other deities, and they feel like surprised by the connection that they feel themselves forming. And I definitely had that, where I just kept doubting, like, I must be making this up, or I must be having delusions of grandeur. Surely this can't be what's happening.
I don't want to interrupt the flow too much, but I just want to ask a question that relates to this, which is that in here, it seems like there's a few times in which you sort of, I don't want to say identify, but you compare Aphrodite with a number of other goddesses, and sort of, have that sort of
almost like a syncretic
conflation of concepts. And so do you see them as all sort of being the same thing, or being interconnected things?
I would say yes and no. There's part of my mind that sometimes wants to go to a very syncretic worldview and philosophy, and then there are other parts of my mind that when I say no, all the gods are separate, and Aphrodite over here may even be different than an Aphrodite from over here in another part of Greece. These Aphrodites aren't the same Aphrodite. So it's one of those, I don't always know that I have a very solid answer on that. I feel like that there are things about the archetype of the goddess of love and sexuality that are very universal concepts. And then there are things about specific goddesses of love and sexuality that are very unique to them. Aphrodite is not Venus, Venus is not Freya, that type of thing.
We'll come back to this in a few minutes. Let's get back into your story. So you were feeling called to Aphrodite while within your traditional. Are you still involved with that group?
Not with that one specifically. It eventually sort of imploded, but from it, my ex-wife and I created another tradition. So sort of as a daughter or a descendant of that tradition, my ex-wife and I created the tradition that I am still a part of now, and that I teach from now.
And is she still a part of the tradition as well, even though she's your ex-wife?
She is, yeah. She was running a coven a few years ago. I'm not sure what her status is with that now. We don't communicate quite as much as we used to.
Sure.
But I do believe she does still have her own involvement with that. And I know that that group is still running. I think she's taken a step back in leadership, but she's still involved.
In this group that sort of came out of that other group, does it have a lot of sort of offshoots coming from you, or is it just sort of a small thing that you're keeping to yourself?
It's small right now, and it probably will stay somewhat small. I don't necessarily anticipate it being, that was not necessarily my goal, was to make it this huge thing. And I don't think my ex had a goal of making it this big thing, but we have always shared our work. So we, back in 2010 or 2011, we created a blog, and we kind of went, the information wants to be out there. Let's just make the information be out there. And then this year, at the beginning of the year, I released a course book for people that are interested in studying with me online. So interested students are able to sort of join the tradition, either very independently, just by working through the course book on their own, or in an online supported format if they're interested in talking with others that are also going through that.
And what's the name of that book?
The name of the book is, it's the Red Thread Academy Year 1 course manual. So, and I have it on my Etsy shop, which is
if people want to sign up for the website, where do they find that?
Okay, so they can find that through my Etsy shop on it's bladeandbroom.etsy.com.
And we're going to come back to this, hopefully, if I remember, and talk specifically kind of about what the curriculum of that looks like. But I want to get back to the story of your life a little bit more. I mean, obviously, sure, we're filling in pieces as we go along.
Yeah, I know.
How is Aphrodite related to this Red Thread course to begin with?
So the way Aphrodite ends up being related to the Red Thread Academy and to my tradition in general, which is called the Spiral Castle tradition, is that we see our 3 tutelary deities as the red god, the white goddess, and the black goddess, or we'll kind of just refer to them as the witch mother and the witch father, with the witch father being that red god and the witch mother being the black and white goddess, sort of 2 aspects of the goddess type figure. Mm-hmm. And there are many expressions. We see many, many expressions in the world of these figures. So the red god, the black and white goddess are archetypes. They are just, not individual deities in and of themselves. They are archetypal figures. And Aphrodite is, for me, one of the most prominent faces of the white goddess that I've experienced in my work. And when I was a student in the other tradition, the tradition that I initially initiated in, I took my second degree initiation was as a priestess. It was as a simple priestess. And that priestesshood could have just been in service to the coven and community, but it also had the opportunity to be in service to deity, specific deity. And in my case, that ended up being Aphrodite. So at that time, and that was back in 2002, I took initiation into Aphrodite's service through my witchcraft tradition. So those 2 things for me are very linked. But in my work as a priestess of Aphrodite, and I didn't find a lot of resources necessarily available at that time. I mean, this was the early 2000s. I won't say that the internet was young, but there were certainly not nearly as many things available. And so I started pulling together resources. I created a Yahoo group, email group, that was the thing you did at the time. That was sort of like a gathering place for people that were drawn to that kind of work, working with either as a devotee of Aphrodite or as a priest or priestess of Aphrodite. And I started saying to myself, these are the kinds of resources that I'm looking for, and I'm not finding them. So I guess I'll start putting them together. And that is really how Aphrodite's Priestess, the book that you have there, came into being. Yeah.
So, my OCD is forbidding me from going further until I ask. So Aphrodite is a good example of the white goddess. What are some examples of the red god and the black goddess as they manifest into more discrete entities?
Yeah. So examples of the red god, Lucifer, Tubal-Cain, Meliktos, almost any forge god. Most of those forge gods work there. Gods of gnosis and enlightenment, gods of wandering the boundaries and finding one's own path. Those are good examples of the red god.
So Aphrodite's husband would fit into that too, since
yes, Hephaestus absolutely fits nicely there.
And so and the black goddess?
And the black goddess is going to be your veiled goddesses, your goddesses of wisdom. Often these are elder goddesses, sometimes more crone-like goddesses, but also sometimes battle goddesses. So often these are goddesses of sacrifice, but not always. They're goddesses of strategy. So Athena fits into that kind of category if we're looking at a Greek type pantheon. And there's a lot in the mythos about that triadic relationship between Aphrodite, Athena, and Hephaestus. And we often see that if we look into a particular pantheon, we can kind of see this triadic grouping of a black goddess, a white goddess, and a red god, sort of working in harmony in some ways, and also sometimes in conflict, to bring out gnosis for an individual. Other examples, the kayak, of Scottish lore is a good example of a black goddess. Kali as a black goddess. There's
so by a lot of your terms, even Isis would sort of fit into that, although she has a strong maternal, but so does Kali. So
yes, yeah, and black goddesses certainly can. Again, because within that black goddess concept, there is often this, the name that we often use for it in our tradition, the name that we use for the black goddess is Kolyo. And Kolyo has at its root this Proto-Indo-European word that means to cover. And so when we get into that concept of covering, there is a very maternal instinct to cover and protect one's young and that which belongs to oneself, and also to veil the mysteries. Whereas the white goddess sort of stands naked and open, and there's a lot of illusion around her. If you think you're seeing everything because she's standing there bare and brazen, sure, but you're sort of dazzled by the light of it and maybe aren't seeing everything as clearly as you think you are.
Like Dolly Parton.
Yes. Yes, the contemporary white goddess. Yes.
A very concealed person who's very intelligent and interesting, and yet presents herself in a way that doesn't. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to turn this into a Dolly Parton
no, it's wonderful.
But
I love it. That's perfect.
So this we can scoot into talking about archetypes for a second here, and sort of the hierarchy of being. So you're pointing to these types, and you're saying that they are more general than the specific things that we talk about, down to deities and then the beings underneath them, I guess, too. What sort of creational role do the gods that you're referring to have, and how does that all fit with the way that the world functions? What's the reason for us to contact these beings for you?
So a lot of our reason for working directly with the gods is ultimately to have a better understanding of ourselves and our place within the universe, what it is that we're supposed to do, not what I'm supposed to do from day to day, but like who I am, and what I'm becoming. The ultimate goal is enlightenment. The ultimate goal is to have better understanding of, I don't know, all the things.
Sure, as much as we can, right?
Right. Yeah.
But so I mean, you've sort of specifically chosen out of, you know, a very large number of possible forms to you know, what is how is this path different from other paths, and why this path as opposed to others?
When my ex and I started talking about witchcraft and what made sense to us from all of the things that we'd both studied before, and there had been a lot. Obviously, I come from a pretty broad background. There's a lot of things, and she came from an equally broad background, and there was a lot of overlap, but there was also a lot that she brought to the table that I didn't know, and a lot that I brought to the table that she didn't know. When we started looking into some of the foundational writings of, for instance, Roy Bowers, aka Robert Cochran, and his writings, for instance, with Joe Wilson, who was here in America, and some of the other pieces that are really often referenced within our types of lines of traditional witchcraft. These were the big pieces that just sort of came out and emerged for us. This is what rose to the surface. And as we started sort of thinking about our cosmology and what our wheel of the year looked like and what our sacred space looked like, there was this distinct overlay that the two were exactly the same thing. That compass was a blueprint of the universe, as it were, and that every deity that we could think of fit into one of those three archetypes, you know. Not necessarily one of those three, because there's also the idea of the green god, who's the brother and the slain and the dying and the resurrecting god, right? And he's not, within our witchcraft tradition, he's not a primary focus. We acknowledge him as being there, but not as the bringer of gnosis necessarily, which is our goal.
Are there other archetypes that are also recognized by you that don't fit in within those four, or is it just those four?
None that I've thought of. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that I haven't had the conversations, or haven't had the meditations, or haven't had that aha moment to reveal them to me. Almost anything else that we've thought of, we've gone, oh, but that's an expression of this one over here.
So these intelligences, the archetypes that are behind them, those, I mean, is saying the red god closer to the truth than saying Hephaestus or Lucifer, or are they the same thing?
That's a good question. I feel like saying the red god is more encompassing of all the expressions of the truth. Hephaestus and Lucifer, Tubal-Cain are all true expressions of the red god, but they're pieces of that expression. And I feel like when we say the red god or the white goddess or the black goddess, we're landing on something that's a more inclusive expression of that truth. But sometimes to the point of being too difficult to work with. Like, not too difficult to work with, but a little too much to wrap one's head around sometimes. And so it can be a lot more meaningful for a person to work with a particular expression.
So the archetypes are more incomprehensible, or they're just, you know, what?
No, they're just more encompassing of a lot of different cultural aspects and a lot of different. There's so much that's involved with them because they're including so many different cultures' expressions of those energies. that I think for some people, especially when they're first getting started with it, it can muddy the waters. And so it can be a lot easier if there's one that's calling to you, one that seems to rise to the surface for you to work with that particular one and to get to know that.
Is there a
deity.
Is there a dyad and a monad beyond these archetypes, or do you see the universe as existing through them and nothing past that?
I don't necessarily see a dyad or a definitely not a monad. I don't feel like, you know, and I've done a lot of thinking about that, you know, looking at, you know, sort of Platonic thought and all of that thing. I feel like the world is inhabited by many, many, many expressions. So I don't feel like it's necessarily drilling down to a one singular expression behind everything.
So,
but I could be wrong. I'm open to being wrong.
Is there and Plato could be wrong, and you know,
right? Absolutely.
The Buddha could be wrong. Everyone can be wrong. There's no
right.
So, but I guess my question is, like, how does the universe come into being from, you know, nothing, or does it not? Is it forever? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm going to say my tradition doesn't necessarily have its own creation story. That's not something that we've either borrowed from somebody else or developed for ourselves. So I don't know. I'm willing to go with scientific thought on that one.
Okay, so the universe comes from a big bang. Where do these archetypes come from? Are they from inside humanity, or are they beyond humanity?
You know, honestly, I'm gonna just say I don't know.
You don't
I
know?
just accept, yeah, I just kind of accept that they exist, and whether they're, and I honestly do not know whether they are a reflection of us or we're a reflection of them. I don't know. I just know that we're gazing at each other, and I'm cool with that.
It's a fair answer. It's a fair answer. So let's talk a little bit about priestess craft in general, and the priestess craft of Aphrodite. I know that Aphrodite's priestess craft is not completely about sexuality, but sexuality is kind of the interesting part to me. So let's talk about that.
Titillating.
How does sacred sexuality play a part in the priestess craft that you both promote and that you do?
So sexuality has had a lot of different roles for me over the years. And it's a very different expression, I feel like, at this time in my life than it was when I first wrote Priestess of Aphrodite. When I first wrote Priestess of Aphrodite, I was coming to festivals and you know, erecting a temple and embodying Aphrodite and being that priestess in the temple who welcomed devotees who wanted to come and interact with Aphrodite in whatever way that meant at the time, you know. And there were a lot of different expressions, most not nearly as exciting sounding, because often the interaction that a person needed was just to be held in a loving space. It's shocking how often people aren't getting that. And so just to be able to come and be accepted, flaws and all, warts and all, and to be, you know, to have your hand held, to be hugged, to be looked square in the eye and told that you're wonderful and that you're worthy of love. Just that is such an intimate and encompassing experience that it often didn't necessarily go into sort of the more exciting aspects of sacred sexuality. But I consider that part of that sacred sexuality work because it is such an intimate moment.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, truly looking into someone's eyes is probably one of the most intimate things that you can do.
Yes.
So when you're doing that in that temple, I take it that you're not doing that as much anymore, but
not as much.
are you taking an invocation of the goddess? Do you feel like you are, the goddess at that time, or are you acting as a priestess of the goddess and just sort of going through the motions? Like, what is that
Right.
experience like from your perspective?
So I see it as as one of the expressions of the priestess's role, or of a priest's role for that matter, to be able to invoke the deity, and to be able to allow them to move through you, to be able to interact with other people. And so when I was setting up and doing that work, I would be invoked for a period of, say, an hour or 2 hours on the days that I was holding temple in that way. And yeah, I would be fully invoked as Aphrodite. Now, when there were other things, there are and still are other things that I do in my service to Aphrodite, including leading rituals and some of the festivals that we have, both historically and some like recreated rituals that are a lot more modern in their context. And I've got another book called Cult of Aphrodite that's sort of based on that, those ritual concepts. And those aren't necessarily fully invoked. Those are more sort of officiating and facilitating ritual experiences, where it might be a dramatic ritual, or it might be a cleansing ritual, or sort of a tutelary ritual, a lesson-based ritual. But for those temple experiences, I was absolutely invoked. And I've recently done work like that too. I just sort of have my own boundaries and limits in place that say, I will only interact up to this point. Sex is not necessarily going to be a thing with just anybody that comes into the temple, because I'm in a monogamous relationship.
But it was a thing in the past? That was something that was on the table?
It could have been, yeah. It has been in the past. It was something that could happen.
And did it?
Yep.
Yeah?
Yep. Yeah.
Seems it's pretty bold to make love to the goddess, I would think, but okay. Just
yeah, I think she sort of initiates that. Okay. And when I have been fully invoked, I very rarely, let's see, there's a presenter who comes to Babalon Rising. He's a professor at one of the nearby universities in Cincinnati. And one of the things, he does a wonderful lecture talking about possessory experience and invocation experience. And he talks about how people have sort of these different levels of possessory experience. And he describes it as different places that you can be seated in a car. If the car is your body, normally you're driving the car, you're in the driver's seat, but then maybe one step off of that is the deity or the spirit is in the driver's seat and you're in the passenger seat. You can see what's happening. You're fully aware of what's going on the road. You can reach over and yank the wheel and have some control, but you're not really the one moving things around. I'm usually in the passenger seat for this type of experience.
You're in the trunk and you just
yeah, there is.
No idea
I very rarely get locked in the trunk. Sometimes I'm in the back seat, maybe reading a book, listening to music. But I'm very, very rarely locked in the trunk, where I am just completely unaware.
And so you talk a bit about sex magic and Heroes Gamos and the sort of great rite kind of stuff. Where does that fit in with this sort of Temple of Aphrodite free-for-all?
Yeah. There are a few different ways that comes into my practice, both historically and now. Obviously, enacting sacred sexuality rites with devotees who have come into the temple can be seen as the Hieros Gamos, although if they're not fully invoked, then not so much. But I have also done at Babalon Rising and in other places sacred sexuality rituals and experiences like, sorry, my brain's like not wanting to come up with the words for it. Sacred touch circle. There's a ritual that we call sacred touch circle that can be anything from just sort of an outer course type experience where, you know, participants are touching the person who's in the center of the circle. Everybody gets to state what their boundaries are so that nobody's sort of crossing those limits. The person in the center gets to state all those things before anybody puts a hand on them and that type of thing. And that can go anywhere from just sort of this massage level of touch experience all the way up to a fully invoked hieroscamos type experience.
With a whole group though?
Usually with the group supporting a couple that's fully invoked.
Cool.
Yeah.
So while we keep crossing across Babalon Rising without really discussing what it is, tell me about that festival and what its purpose is and
Babalon Rising?
Yeah.
So Babalon Rising Panthelemic Festival is a, it's been happening since 2006. It did not happen last year, and we're still debating whether or not we're going to have it. Actually, so this week is the week that would normally be Babalon Rising. This is BR week.
This is our Babalon Rising right now. You and me.
We are Babalon Rising right now. Yeah. So, and my husband and I are trying to, he's my other co-director. We're trying to figure out if we're going to have sort of an abridged version of Babalon Rising, you know, a shortened version, maybe sometime in the fall, since this week was not really something that we could pull together with everything that was going on.
Yeah.
In 2021. But
what state do you live in now?
We live in Kentucky.
And is that where Babalon Rising is now, or is it?
No, it still happens in Indiana.
Okay, but not at that same place that it was at before?
No, no, we've been at a place called Camp Midian since 2014. So, and we're actually on the board at Camp Midian as well. So we helped create that land with some of our friends.
Okay, cool.
And well, we didn't create the land already existed.
Right. But you know,
but
the caring,
the facilities,
for it, attending it,
and the community. But the festival itself has, at this point, it has 4 tracks of events that are happening simultaneously. We've got a traditional ceremonial magic track that's sort of our keynote track. That's usually where our keynote speakers are coming from and presenting on. That kind of has all of the traditional magical concepts that you would think of. And then we've got the Scarlet track, which is the sacred sexuality and sex magic track, where all of the workshops, hands-on demonstrations, rituals, experiences happen in a different area that's a little bit more secluded. And then we've got a chaos magic track, and the Scarlet track and the chaos magic track have been happening since 2009 and 2010 respectively. And then we have a new track that's called the Emergent Magic track, which is has emerged out of the Chaos Magic track, actually, in a lot of ways, but it is kind of a blend of some different things and has the opportunity to really go in a lot of different directions. But it's,
when you're presenting about your work, which track do you present in?
Most often on the Scarlet track. But so if I'm presenting about Aphrodite at all, that usually goes on the Scarlet track. There are times when I present about a witchcraft related topic, or when I present, for instance, about working with spirits, particularly goetic spirits, and that's going to go on the traditional magic track.
And so goetic spirits, we haven't really touched upon this at all. Is that a significant part of your witchcraft tradition as well, or is that?
Not necessarily part of the tradition to work with goetic spirits per se, but I'm very drawn to working with goetic spirits. Working with spirits is definitely part of our tradition, and I've always had a big draw to goetic spirits.
And so let's talk for a second about your curriculum in your course, your year one course that you can buy the book on Etsy, and you can find the course where?
The course is on Etsy, so you.
Oh, okay. The course.
Yeah, buying the book gives you access to the course. Yeah.
Okay, great, cool. So, tell me about it. What do you learn?
So, it's set up that if a person wants to go from first through third degree in our witchcraft tradition, we've got 3 levels of books to be able to do that with. So the first book is an entire year's curriculum, and it's set up in weekly lessons. They're entirely self-contained. They're extraordinarily detailed. I used to be a high school English teacher. So they're very much set up in that, here's the lesson objective, here are the materials that you're going to need, here's the study guide, the study notes, here are the follow-up questions, here's the assignment, and here's some additional resources, if you want to dive in even further. So it's very, very organized in that sense.
Is there someone keeping track of you in the course, or no?
Yes. Right now that's me. At some point in the future, there may be a team of us, but right now, the course participants are few enough in number that it's easy enough for just me personally to be able to keep track of folks that are submitting their work. It's not required that a person submit their work to me necessarily. There are several people that have purchased the course that I know are working on the materials, but they're just doing it on their own. They don't necessarily want my stamp of approval or need my stamp of approval. They're just moving through the materials for their own benefit. But if a person wants sort of to be more involved with the tradition, I need to see the work.
So what sorts of matters are being taught in these weekly lessons?
Everything from divination to spirit work, to ritual work, to everything. A little bit of astrology, with the opportunity to get more involved in that, for people that are very interested. Year one is, I call year one foundations, and it's very much about sort of getting that grounding material to be able to move into deeper concepts, but definitely divinatory work, some research to have a good understanding of some of the big concepts within traditional witchcraft, ritual work, flying out, astral travel. It's typically called flying out within tradcraft, but that idea of journey work.
That's kind of the next topic that I want to talk to you about. But before we get there, I just want to ask, what is the deeper stuff? You're talking about astrology and tarot and all that stuff. What's the next step after that? What are you learning after that? Year two.
Yeah, so within year 2, which is practicum, students have a choice at the beginning of that year of what it is that they're going to dive more into, sort of what their specialty might be, and there's a focus then as they go through some of the materials, because we do go through our wheel of the year again, we go through all of the Sabbats again, and we're working with a lot of the same spirits again that we've worked with already in year 1. But there's the idea of sort of customizing their work to fit their own needs and diving deeper into what that specialty might be. So if they're very interested in herbalism, or if they're very interested in the healing arts, or they're very interested in divination and prophecy, or they're very interested in spirit work, there's a focus on sort of flavoring all of the aspects of the work with that particular focus in mind.
Gotcha.
So that they have the opportunity to really become a specialist.
In year 3?
Yeah, and then year 3 is focusing a lot more on spirit work and journey work, sort of really opening up to getting those messages, and to being a very independent practitioner, and being able to teach and lead within the community, whatever that might look like for that person.
And so the year 1 you have kind of open. You don't have to be really a part of your tradition. Years 2 and 3, are those open as well, or do you only get to do year 2 and 3 if you've like kind of decided this is my thing?
Yeah, with year 2, you'd need to have taken year 1, so they build on each other.
Right. I mean, I was presuming, but
yeah.
But I mean, do you have to be part of your, could consider yourself a part of your tradition at that point, or can you just take it? You've done your, I mean, this is a theoretical question, obviously. No one's going to do a year of work and not committed themselves to
so
it.
A person could theoretically pick up the year 1 materials, go through them entirely independently, never send me their work necessarily, but still, there's a self-initiation at the end of year 1, and there's a self-initiation at the end of year 2. And I include a self-initiation at the end of year 3 as well. And I might not ever see that person, because maybe they just wanted to do that independently. They wanted those experiences for themselves. They're not really necessarily interested in being hooked into the community of those of us that are doing it. They just wanted this for their own particular growth. And I'm fine with that.
So you do, it is open, the whole course.
It is open. Yeah, it is open. If somebody at the end of year 3, though, I offer the opportunity to have initiation within our tradition, but that's only open to people who've been submitting their work from year 1 through year 3. I have to see it before I am going to initiate you.
Okay, so back to visionary work. We see that that's a significant portion of your curriculum. But I want to talk about you, not the curriculum and not what other people do, but I want to talk about your life and your experiences. What role do divisions and experiencing other planes, what role does that have in your life?
Quite large, actually. Yeah. I would say that that visionary work, that trance work, meditation work, journeying out, flying out, that's a large part of what witchcraft looks like for me these days.
And so when you're having those experiences, are these sort of out of body experiences like Robert Monroe, or are they more sort of spirit vision where you can still talk to a person about what's happening?
I've had both. So it really just depends on how I've gotten to that point, because there are a few different techniques that I might use to get into that space. But more often, I would be able, if there was somebody immediately right there with me, and there's often not. I'm very frequently doing the work alone, but if there were somebody right there with me, I'd probably be able to talk to them about what I'm seeing and experiencing, without necessarily pulling myself out of that experience.
And so what are you seeing and experiencing in those things? Not any specifics of your own, private spiritual things, but like what is the environment like? Are you in a state in which things are vividly being presented to you, or is it more images coming to you? How does that all feel to you?
Again, I think it sort of depends on sort of my preparatory, approach, and how well I achieved sort of getting into that state. Because I think some days I don't go through the ritual of preparation quite as well as I'd like.
Sure.
And maybe, I'm not quite as into the space as I want to be, but I feel like
Do you discount the experiences that you have then, or do you?
no, not necessarily, but I do sort of like poke at them a little bit more and maybe test them a little bit more and seek confirmation through things like divination or consulting with somebody else that might have been looking for answers on a similar topic. If I knew that somebody else in my coven, for instance, was doing work on the same question, I might say, well, what kind of results did you get? Did you see anything along these lines? Or did you get confirmation that we should be moving in this direction, that direction, that kind of thing? Because I might not discount it, but just doubt myself a little bit more.
So are these visions generally a question asking, and then you just have whatever vision comes to you, or are you seeking out a specific entity in that, or what's going on?
Sometimes it's for a question. If there is a question on my mind, then I may go into a visionary state in order to be able to find answers in another realm, in another world. But sometimes it's just part of the cyclical nature of the work that I'm doing, and that it's time to go to that place. It's time to go and visit, the keeper or the beings in that particular area, because it's the season when I do that.
And are those sorts of things a part of the coursework that you teach, or is that something separate from that?
Yeah, it is part of the coursework. Yeah, we get into that more in year 2, but in that practicum. But it is definitely part of the coursework.
The deeper stuff.
Yeah. A little bit deeper. Yeah.
So in an ideal vision, are you seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting? Are all of those senses there?
Yeah, ideally they are. And I know definitely, if I write a guided meditation, for instance, for somebody where I'm trying to help them get into a visionary state, I definitely use all of those sensory cues to try to help them be present as we're sort of launching into into visionary work. But ideally, I have experiences with all of the senses. But I will say that for myself, the ones that really stand out tend to be vision, some auditory sensation, and a sense of smell. Like I tend to smell things in the environment. To sort of let me know that I'm on the right track, or just maybe not even the right track, just that I'm present, that I'm there. But I get a lot visually. A lot of it is visually, and I'll say that, like with the auditory, it doesn't always. It's sort of more of that knowing than hearing particularly. It's like I heard it a moment ago, like I still have the memory of somebody saying it, more than hearing it with my ears, as it were.
So when you're in conversation with a being, how does that communication function then?
Often very similarly, where I have images, very strong visual images, a very, very strong sense of just sort of words coming into my mind in a very different tone of voice, and a very different sort of speech pattern than what I use. Again, as if I just heard them say it a moment ago, but not necessarily as if I can hear a disembodied voice speaking in the room.
As if it's actually in the room.
As if it's actually there.
It's more a consciousness experience.
More of a consciousness, yeah.
And when you're seeing an entity or a landscape or any of those places, does it stay consistent, or are there things that sort of change over time, such as lighting or size or location even?
Yeah, for me, things there will be things about it that will stay consistent. But there can be quite a lot that changes. So the time of day may change, which obviously would change the lighting quite a lot. Decorative elements may change. You know, if it's an interior room, there may be things that would indicate what season it's supposed to be based on draperies or tapestries or, you know, floral arrangements that are in the room or something of that nature, you know, where just based on greenery or lack of greenery that's in the room, I may know, be given a clue at least as to something that's different about the season.
And so when you're working with a goetic being, for instance, or a deity, what size do they usually come to you? I ask this question to people who are more visual. When people aren't, I skip it. But because, like, you know, some people will have different experiences. Just describe your experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So hadn't really thought of that one before. So there are some that have come to me, and my experience of them is that they're fairly human sized, you know, not particularly large and imposing. And then there are some that have come to me and I'm like, whoa, you're very intimidating. You know, because they're quite large. So boy, I feel like all of my answers are like, well, it really just depends.
I mean, you know, I don't think that's totally wrong. I try to get a little information in the midst of that, but
yeah. But yeah, I feel like several of the ones that I've worked with very closely, I have the sense of being, there's one that I work with very, very closely, and she often appears to me as like a young looking teenage girl who needs help, but I know that she doesn't need help because she's there to help me, right? But when she first started showing up in my life was before I even started really working with goetic spirits. She was sort of my entryway into working with goetic spirits, and it was when I started asking, "Who are you?" You know, pardon me, but who are you? That I sort of launched into that work. But she often looks like a 13 or 14-year-old girl, and about that size to me, which I know that 13 and 14-year-old girls don't come in the same size necessarily, right. But
there's a variety.
There's a variety, yeah. So I suppose maybe about the size I was as a 13 or 14-year-old girl, you know, 5'1", 5'2", small-ish, and you know, this particular one often looks a little waif-like and perhaps drowned, wet, you know, like she's just come out of a lake or just come out of a pond.
But human other than that, or?
Yeah, most of the time. Yeah, most of the time.
What I mean, without, I don't want to get involved in your intimate relationship.
No, it's fine. She's also shown up regularly around my house as a black cat, which is not something that she is noted for within the Goetia, you know, within any kind of the transcripts of the Goetia that you see, any of the manuscripts. But nevertheless, almost everybody that I've ever lived with has reported seeing a black cat that simply wasn't there. At the time, well, not at the time, initially, my ex-wife had 2 black cats, but they stayed in a specific part of the house. They were always on one level of the house. And in 2 different houses where we had sort of an upstairs and downstairs situation, people that we lived with said, oh, one of the cats, because she had, like I said, 2 black cats. One of the cats was upstairs earlier, and we were like, no, none of the black cats were upstairs. And she was like, oh, you know, in one case it was a roommate, in another case it was my stepmother, and we're very insistent, no, the cat was definitely up here, it jumped on the bed, or it followed me into this room. And We were like, that's just not possible. Until I realized what was going on. And then I'm like, oh, that's definitely possible. You know, after we started having enough of these experiences, we were like,
Right.
it's this other cat.
I have a spirit cat that's around the corner a lot when I look, but
Yeah.
probably not the same one. So I want to talk on one more subject, and then we can wrap this up, and maybe we can have another conversation in the future. But
Sure.
I want to talk to you about practical magic. By that I mean magic to kind of like make stuff happen in the world. What part does that play in your life?
Right now, for me, a little bit less. I do a little bit less of that than I used to do. So it used to be quite a large piece of the magic that I did. I did different kind of talismanic work and lots of different spell work on a very regular basis. But I do a lot less of that now. And I think for me, there's been just a bit of a shift in the sense of doing a lot more of this sort of spirit-based work.
But that doesn't take on a practical nature. You don't ask the spirits for anything? Or?
I do ask them for things, and I make offerings when I do that. And that can be seen as practical magic in that sense, but it's often in that sense of I need assistance with this. This is the outcome that I might like to see, you know, or generally the outcome that I'd like to see. Here's the offering for assisting me with that. But not necessarily doing, you know, candle workings with that, or doing, you know, making a talisman or empowering, empowering things like quite like I used to do, where it was very arts and craftsy.
Do you see that as a step up in magic, where you are no longer needing to do that, or do you think that anyone can just start at the devotional offering, requesting things level, and skip the talismans altogether?
I feel like anybody can start with the devotional, you know, votive type, you know, offerings and do that. I don't necessarily see it as a hierarchy. I just think it's a different way of working. And it may be that I get very drawn back to wanting to do things where I have a physical item that's a focus for me for the work. And I know a lot of times those items can also be votary in their nature as well. So
no, it's not mutually exclusive categories.
They're not mutually exclusive, right? So but no, I don't necessarily see it as a progression that I've made into something higher or more elevated. It's just sort of a different expression and where I feel comfortable working right now.
Fair enough. So final question. If you could give one piece of advice to a young witch or magician who is just coming into their practice, you know, in any of the various places you have experience, from OTO to traditional witchcraft to Aphrodite priestesshood, what would that piece of advice be, if there is one for all?
My advice would be to balance research with actively doing whatever it is that your magic is. I feel like you should be doing research, you know, don't deny that part of yourself. Dig in and read and watch good videos and talk to people about what they're doing, you know, so feed your mind that way, but don't just live in your mind. Get it into your hands, get it into your body, get it into the world, even if it's not pretty, even if you don't think that it's perfect, do the thing. It'll become perfect for you. It'll be your perfect.